Institutions of civil society, the things we belong to, are what make the good life possible. And if we care about the working class, we will try to build those up, the religious, the secular, all aimed at bringing people together.
Well, we're going to get started. Good evening. I'm Pete Peterson, Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate Policy School, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you here to tonight's event, a discussion about Tim Carney's important book, Alienated America, and not only some of the things that he learned in writing the book, which analyzed the 2016 presidential election, but what it might portend for 2020. This is the second event that we've co-hosted around this book. We actually helped to launch Tim's book last year, right around this time in Washington, D.C., with our friends at the Trinity Forum. And so it's great to welcome Tim here to the West Coast and here to Malibu to look at the 2016 election and our American political climate in some ways that I think are pretty provocative and important as we think about where we are in our politics nationally, certainly in this election year of 2020. Tim's going to talk more about his book, but I have to say that in some ways Tim's book is a next step to the other very important book, which I think if you haven't read Tim's book, if you haven't read Charles Murray's Coming Apart, there really isn't a way that you can understand the 2016 election. Obviously, we look at voting results, and as we're going through the primaries and caucuses, many of us are watching not only the final results, but the individual categories of voters and how they're voting. And obviously now we're looking at the Democratic Party and their many candidates, and it's interesting to see how the different ethnic categories, household income, educational attainment, suburbs versus rural versus urban voters are breaking into different tribes, if you will, as it pertains to the Democratic candidates. As Tim will talk about, we saw the same thing with the Republican race back in 2016. And again, it's a very important way of understanding where we are in our politics. Certainly at the School of Public Policy, we care deeply about these issues. We often say that we're about putting the public back into public policy. And part of that is understanding not only the quantitative side of public policy, but what are the different influencing factors, both in society and culture, that are influencing our politics. And I don't think you can look at our national politics without understanding that politics is really downstream from culture. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome up Tim. Tim is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also the senior political columnist for the Washington Examiner. And so without any further ado, welcome up Tim Carney.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I was going to say on this beautiful night, but I think out here every night's a beautiful night, so maybe it's not as big of a sacrifice for you guys. But you are missing part of the Democratic debate, so I have to apologize for that. I hope to be a lot more enlightening than that debate will be. I'm a political journalist, and I was telling Pete beforehand that when I had an idea for the next book I wanted to write, it was pretty bound up in politics. And I went up to a boss at AEI and I told him the idea. He said, maybe try to write about something bigger than just politics. Let politics lead you to the story, but try to write about something bigger. And that's what I think I tried to accomplish in Alienated America. It's a story, I'm going to talk a lot about politics, but it's not just a story about politics. It's about the question, is the American dream dead? It's about the perception that the American dream is dead. So it's a story about work, it's a story about family, it's a story about faith. But yes, it's a story about how Donald Trump became the president of the United States. But I want to make a little distinction about the way I analyze all this. It's not about who voted for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton, or who loves Donald Trump today, or who's going to vote for Donald Trump, or who supports Brett Kavanaugh, or anything like that. This is about the people who never voted before and came out of the woodwork in the early primaries in 2016 to support this guy. These are about the people I found standing in line for 4 hours on a cold day in Milwaukee, waiting to go to an arena when many of them had said they swore off politics because they could never trust a politician, but they were going to support Donald Trump. He rallied people who had never been in politics before, who didn't fit into an ideological formula that I was used to. And what they were people who believed what Donald Trump said. And Donald Trump said, the American dream is dead. So why did people believe that? So yes, because I'm a political reporter, my quest to figure this out begins in Iowa. And because I'm an Irish Catholic, it begins in a bar. Joe's Place I love that it's Iowa Avenue in Iowa City. Joe's Place in Iowa City, right before the 2016 caucuses, so a little over 4 years ago. I met this couple that worked at the university, and she said she was from Orange City, Iowa. Now, I've been covering Iowa caucuses since 2004. I didn't know Orange City. I said, what does the orange mean? And she said, well, we're Dutch there. Not Pennsylvania Dutch, but like Dutch. I said, I'm Irish. I kind of take some pride in that. We have St. Patrick's Day party. My middle name's Patrick. My kids' names are Sean and Brendan and Margaret Mary. And to be even more Irish, I have 3 more kids besides those 3 that I've named. So I take the ethnicity stuff seriously. So I'm like, so how Dutch are you guys? And this woman, whose name was Holly Vander something, said, let me put it this way. I used to march in wooden clogs past Windmill Square at our annual Tulip Festival. So why does the Dutch stuff matter? Well, I went there. I found one, so this quote from the New Yorker covered it a couple years later. Orange City is like this, it's a great place. A lot of rural Iowa has a lot of problems. And the belief that the American dream is dead. I didn't find that belief in Orange City. The New Yorker wrote, there are plenty of jobs. It'll take you 5 minutes to drive to work. When you have children, we'll help you take care of them. People here share your values. It's a good Christian place, and they care about you. If anything happens, they'll have your back. And when I've been there a couple times, I found broadly that was the view of Orange City. So what happened in 2016 in the caucuses there? It was Donald Trump's single worst county in the Republican caucuses was Sioux County. It then became his single best county in the general election. So this county with 50%, 40% Dutch population, the most heavily Dutch county in all of America, something I didn't know existed. We will write about like the Hispanic vote or the Catholic vote. Apparently there was a Dutch vote going on in Iowa. So then I looked at Michigan. Trump is those red counties in the primaries, Cruz is the yellowish ones. Trump won all of Michigan, except for like Holland, Michigan, and the really Dutch parts of Michigan. So this really was an actual phenomenon. And I saw a similar thing closer to home. That's where I live. You can see there's a road coming up from the bottom, Arcola Avenue, a road going out the top, Kent Mill Road. Both of those have Orthodox synagogues on them. So that's right around my house. Silver Spring, it's actually a middle-class part of the D.C. suburbs. In the Republican primaries, Trump won that whole area. He lost the 2 precincts adjacent to the synagogues. So what's going on here? One of the teachings of Judaism that's observed by the Orthodox people who attend these 2 synagogues is you can't operate machinery on the Sabbath. So you have to live walking distance from your synagogue. So in those neighborhoods that you're looking at on that map there is an incredibly tightly knit community built around common faith, common values, raising children together. And so after Maryland voted, I went to Oostburg, Wisconsin, a Dutch village, and I saw obviously what was going on. Everybody came pouring in from the 9 o'clock at the Christian Reformed Church, and then the 9:15 at the Presbyterian Church, and then the 9:30 at the Reformed Church of America, which is not the same as the Christian Reformed Church, and I, as a New York Irish Catholic, did not know that. There was a 4th one there, Christian Reformed Church, First Presbyterian Church, First Reformed Church, and Bethel Orthodox Presbyterian. 4 churches in the Reformed tradition in this village of 2,000 people. So what makes these places like Orange City and Oostburg and Holland, Michigan so tightly knit? It was the churches. But here's the thing. Most of America is not, well, let me put it another way. America is secularizing rapidly. The fastest growing group of sort of religious identity are nuns. And when I first heard that as a Catholic, I was excited. I thought there was a lot of sisters joining holy orders. But no, N-O-N-E. People who don't have, they're not declaring themselves atheists, but they're declaring they don't have a religious affiliation. Spiritual but not religious is another growing thing. And a lot of people who do consider themselves religious increasingly aren't going to church. So we have these places either around a middle-class neighborhood here or back in the Midwest that have really strong community. It shows up politically on a map because the guy who said the American dream is dead didn't appeal in these places. They believe that the American dream is alive in these places. But if less and less of America is religious, are there any other places where the American dream is alive and well? And that is the elites. It is true. So a big part of my book takes place in a different part of the DC suburbs called Chevy Chase, Maryland. It's the wealthiest municipality and arguably the wealthiest region in the history of the world. So that's what I want to sort of focus on and what I hope we're going to talk about here, which is people like to talk about privilege. And class privilege is a real thing. But I'm going to argue that just looking at money or other material measurements does not adequately discuss and cover what privilege is. The real privilege of the elites is something closer to what the people in Orange City have. Institutions. And it's not going to be a Christian Reformed church. It's not going to be the Orthodox synagogue. It's not going to be a Church of Latter-day Saints in some of these wealthiest places. The real privilege are strong institutions of civil society that bring people together. And it can be a church, it can be a Christian Reformed church in the Netherlands, not in the Netherlands, in Iowa, or it can be a really strong public school with involved parents in Chevy Chase, or in a place like Malibu. It will be a library where all the parents are involved and you have tons of volunteers setting up programs. So first, I just quickly want to talk about some of the numbers in the book that I point out about the elites. The first thing to realize is, so Chevy Chase as an example, basically every child in Chevy Chase, Maryland, this village of 2,000 like Oostburg, is, like Oostburg, raised by a pair of married parents who live together. So if you're a conservative Christian who thinks that the liberal elites are a bunch of decadent swingers and feminists who never get married or anything like that, you're wrong. The truth is, the liberal elites are practicing what conservative Christians like me are preaching. And one way to describe it is called the success sequence. This was formulated by friends of mine at Brookings Institution, who pointed out that if you finish school, get a job, then get married, in that order, and then have kids, in that order, your chances of being in poverty are approximately 1%. And if you look at the elite places, that's the main privilege that they have. So when we talk about wealth, there's this sad fact that your self-reported happiness goes up as your income goes up to about $75,000. If you get filthy rich, you're not that much happier than if you're upper middle class. But people who make $20,000 are less happy than people who make $40,000, are less happy than people who make $75,000. But what Charles Murray found when he was doing Coming Apart, and this was one of the real eye-opening things, what Murray found was that increase in happiness as your income goes up is only true because as your income goes up, the other thing that goes up is your likelihood to have satisfaction with work, your likelihood to be married and in a family, and your likelihood to have strong connections to your community. Sure enough, a lot of the data suggests that what makes you happier is going to be the strong, intact families. So that a place like Chevy Chase, voted like the precincts right around the Orthodox synagogues, to me, in those early caucuses, in the general election, they voted totally different. In the early caucuses, they didn't vote for Donald Trump. They didn't believe the American dream is dead. Michigan, we showed you Holland. One of the other places where Trump did really poorly was Grosse Pointe, really wealthy part right there. So we see these two different types of places politically. These are Trump's 20 worst counties, or 30 worst counties or so in the early primaries and caucuses. 3 of them you see there are Dutch. Most of them are Mormon. And then a handful of them are among the top 20 most educated counties in all of America. So again, these seem like two different types of places, but they're one. They both have those really strong institutions of civil society that bring people together. And so again, they both have the same good outcomes, but they're driven not just by money, because again, Madison County, Idaho, where Trump did really poorly in the primaries, not a wealthy place, but guess what it has? Very low drug problems, very low divorce rates, very low out-of-wedlock birth. And it's certainly true in Sioux County, Iowa. So just to look at some of the numbers in these elite places, while 50% of babies born to working-class women are born out of wedlock, it's only 10% for the college-educated. If you're a parent in the upper third of income, your children are half as likely to have a child out of wedlock as the children of parents in the lower third. College-educated men are much more likely to get married and half as likely to get divorced. And you see it again and again. Your test scores in a high school are going to be correlated with the average income in the high school. But the real privilege, the thing keeping people's lives together and helping them have success is going to be strong families, which are supported by strong communities. And I say supported by for a reason. One of the big things I want to drive home is that the nuclear family is a great thing, although David Brooks just wrote a piece in the Atlantic magazine saying the nuclear family was a mistake. It's a gross overstatement, but what he's trying to say there is that the nuclear family is not enough. So that's a picture of my daughter Eve a couple years ago. She was very sick, and she kept getting worse and worse throughout the weekend. And on Sunday, while my wife was at Mass with our oldest daughter, I was home holding Eve, and she just was clearly totally collapsing. She could barely breathe because of the stuff building up in her lungs. So I tried calling my wife. She didn't answer. You don't answer your phone at church, right? So I put the baby in the stroller, start sprinting down the street. I'm texting my wife. I'm like, Eve's really bad. I'm taking her to urgent care. Urgent care center was like, yeah, she needs oxygen more than we can give her in our oxygen machines here. So finally my wife looks at her phone, sees what's going on, gets up. This is one of my favorite things. She's going to run down to the urgent care center or drive because she actually has a car. And then she turns to my daughter and says, Lucy, you stay here. Go sit with Dory, and Dory, a mom of a friend, so basically a parish grandma. Dory will give you a ride home, otherwise somebody else will. And then over the course of the next week while we're in the hospital, and Eve gets all better, so I always try to skip to that slide so nobody worries about her. Over the course of the next week, so many people bring us so much food that we end up having to give it away. Why are the Carneys giving away food? Oh, their daughter's in the hospital. But they weren't just friends of ours giving food. It was people from our parish. It was people from my wife's book club. It was people from our swim club. It was people from AEI and the Examiner where I work. The things that were binding us to these other people who went out of their way and made our life livable by driving the carpool, by watching our other kids while we switched off at the hospital, we were always connected to them through institutions. And so the institutions are the key to the good life. So what's happening in the places where things are falling apart? People don't belong to as many things. This is Robert Putnam wrote this in Bowling Alone 20 years ago, and it's more true today. I said people go to church less, people belong to book clubs less, people volunteer less, people go to the PTA less. All of the things that would count as belonging to something, most of us do less, except for the people in the communities that are just centered around churches and for the people in the real elite communities. So this is just a quick chart about the retreat from marriage. This asks the question, is a woman married at age 40 by education level. The red line is college-educated women. The bottom blue line is women who didn't go to college. The middle is women who went to 2 years of college. There used to be no difference. 1960s all the way on the left, 85%. Drop off in all three education groups, much bigger drop off among the working class. Now it's less than half of high school, of women with no college education are married at age 40. So why is that? It's divorce, it's never getting married. Again, go back to what we went through with Eve in the hospital. Raising children is not something two people can do. To quote a wise woman, it takes a village to raise a child. People, to pursue what they really want to do in their life, what they need is an infrastructure of institutions around them. And they need to be directed at, the family, the nuclear family, the extended family, at raising children, at pursuing joint higher goods, that sort of thing. So the real privilege that the elites have in this country is the infrastructure that makes it possible to raise a child. And so in our increasingly individualistic and secular world, I feel like it's almost a secret, especially because increasingly politics is lining up that if you have a college degree and high income, that you're going to be on the left. Well, a lot of the message coming from San Francisco is, well, you get to define your own nature of family. But if you look at the actual data, which my colleagues, Brad Wilcox and his colleague Wendy Wang did in San Francisco, they found that the richest neighborhoods in San Francisco, every single child is being raised by a pair of married parents, basically. Among Californians aged 18 to 50, the college-educated were far more likely than those with no college degree to agree that we should celebrate diversity of family structures, blah, blah, blah. So the same people who are having not very diverse family structures, two married parents living with their children, are the same ones saying, oh, everybody should do more things. You should try more things. And while these places are secularizing, the liberal elite places are secularizing, they're finding other institutions. But in the working class, in middle America, when people fall away from church, it's not because they're going to yoga or running their kids in elite soccer teams. They're falling away from the rest of society. And then it's too hard to do the work of trying to build up a good life and build up a family. So we should talk about it, but again, the institutions of civil society, the things we belong to, are what make the good life possible. And if we care about the working class, we will try to build those up, the religious, the secular, all aimed at bringing people together and raising a family and living the good life possible. Thank you very much.
So I want to go back to that time going through Iowa and ask a question about, and I think what's so fascinating about this book is that you did not start out to write this book.
Nope.
It kind of came to you. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the process of learning that you were seeing something that Murray had seen almost prophetically, I would argue, back in 2012 when he wrote Coming Apart, but you were actually seeing play out in front of you politically.
So one of the funniest moments, and almost most embarrassing moments for me, even though I was finishing writing the first draft of the book, and I said, I'm going to listen to every interview I have on, because you interview hundreds of voters. I said, I'm just going to sit down and listen to all these interviews to see if there's anything I miss. And it was not in Iowa, but in South Carolina, the very first Trump rally I covered. I walked up to a guy with a Make America Great Again hat on his head. And I said, you say Make America Great Again, what's not great about America? And I was expecting him to say something about, oh, well, immigrants are taking jobs of the working class or the factories, or even something about like a cultural decline. People aren't getting married. And he said, when I was a kid, on every Memorial Day, all the boys would go out and plant flags in the cemetery. And then we'd have a parade. And the mayor gave a speech. And I was like, no, cut that out. I'm not asking about what you did when you were a kid. I want to know what's wrong with America, not what's wrong with your little hometown community. He's like, no, you don't understand. This doesn't happen anymore. we don't know our neighbors. I'm like, I'm sorry you don't know your neighbors, man. I'm asking a bigger question. And so the guy is handing me what became the thesis for my book, but I was so looking for something economic and political that I couldn't hear it. And then it was slowly, bit by bit, and it was a Dutch thing where I was just, somebody said, I asked Ted Cruz, I said, why are you winning the Dutch vote? And he said, well, Tim, Donald, he's not very nice. The Dutch people, they're nice. They want a nice guy. And I'm thinking, nice like Ted Cruz? And then somebody else said that the Dutch were upset because Donald Trump was appropriating the color orange. So you can tell I was like casting about, trying to come up with an explanation of it. But as I did this, I was reading, and I was reading Tocqueville, and I was reading Murray, and I was reading Putnam and Bowling Alone. And I realized that these things I was reading about were telling the story that I was seeing. And so I did go down to Chevy Chase Village Hall. It's like 10 miles from my house. And again, like the village meeting had like 100 people there. Like if you go to a town meeting in most places, almost nobody's there. They have 20 committees all stocked by volunteers, and the meeting, like the government meeting with like the village manager and the village board, the Women's Garden Club had collected and created bouquets to put in the lobby for the reception after the meeting. These people were really taking seriously, like as a conservative, we're like, you need to be involved on the local level. These people who then in the general election would vote 85% for Hillary were really taking that seriously. And so that, all of these things opened my eyes throughout it.
I want to pull apart, as you've done in the talk, but just to make sure that this point is made to the audience, the separation between the sense of community and communitarianism, if you will, and household income. And to look at it not at the lower end, but actually at the higher end, because you also look at a few communities in here where actually the household income is very high, but the sense of community is not there. And these were also some of the so-called Trump districts in the early primaries.
So an interesting, so first of all, one general stereotype is, some people think, okay, all these rich people live up long gated driveways and they don't know their neighbors and that sort of thing. And that's true in some places, but it's not the norm. High income, high education people, again, tend to, and all the data show this, tend to be more involved in their community, live in places with higher social trust and that kind of thing. But again, I argue that the money doesn't do it, obviously. Having more money doesn't make you trust other people more, and it doesn't make other people trust you. So there's some other causal mechanism. So one of the types of places I looked at was places where all of a sudden people were making decent income. But again, it came all of a sudden. So there wasn't the organic, slow development of community institutions. So that was fracking towns. And so there's one study that looked at all sorts of them, but where these towns, I went to Williston, North Dakota. There was basically nothing in Williston, North Dakota in 2004. Then they found the shale, the oil shale way deep down, so they start fracking. And so all of a sudden jobs show up, specifically jobs for guys who don't have any more than a high school degree. If you go to Williston with a high school degree, if you went in 2011, I'm not encouraging any of you guys to drop out and do this, but if in 2011 you dropped out, and I did meet a dad and son from Los Angeles who had to take a bus up because they didn't have enough money to even buy a used car or anything. And once you pass a drug test, you're making $18 an hour with no training, no skills, or anything. If you have a commercial driver's license, you're making $100,000, boom. It's a sort of place where I was warned not to go to one bar called DK's because there's always fights there. But I'm a journalist, so of course I went to DK's. There were no fights there because it wasn't payday. And it was during Lent, and I'd given up alcohol, but as I started walking towards there, I called my wife. I was like, these people aren't going to talk to me unless I order a beer. And my wife was like, you can drink if you want to, but I don't know that your wife is allowed to give you a dispensation. Usually that's up to bishops or something like that. But
there were no churches there.
But there, yeah, exactly. Well, that's the thing. So
Right.
in Williston, the marriage rate did not go up as the money came pouring in. And that's one of the things. In Oostburg and in Chevy Chase, people get married. In working class places suffering alienation, people don't get married. And so this liberal economist had predicted that, oh, now these working class guys are going to get married because even though they don't have a college education, they have money. So you try to separate the variables is what you try to do. But obviously, you only work with what's given you. And in these fracking towns, we got this experiment. What if we separate education and income? Well, you didn't get more marriage. And I don't think it's because college teaches you how to get married. I think it's because in this place, there wasn't those institutions. The businesses that instantly sprouted up were strip clubs. The men all lived in what was called man camps, where you have, it's like the most awesome dorm ever. Like you have your own flat screen TV. There's a triple wide trailer that has ping pong tables and pool tables and a 24/7 buffet of fast food. Again, I'm not encouraging any of you guys to go and drop out and go there, but it was kind of cool to visit it. But cool in an immature way, not in a I'm building a life sort of way.
Yeah.
It's no kind of place to raise a kid. So in those places, so if you go now, they've started a little league. Your community takes time and has to organically grow up. So now I bet the marriage rate is increasingly. But the first 5 years of all that money pouring in, there was no impact at all. And it wasn't just North Dakota, it was also Texas, Pennsylvania, these other fracking towns. The money without the institutions doesn't make a place start to look like one of these stronger communities.
So you've been to Iowa already this year. Is there anything now that you've gone back 4 years later that you're seeing might portend for some things to watch now that we're looking at the Democratic candidates? Are there some of the same kind of sorting and mapping from the communitarian towns to the ones that aren't so much?
So there is a little bit of that. And the cleanest thing so far, and I literally was just crunching the numbers before coming down here, the wealthiest counties in Iowa all went very strongly in the caucuses for Pete Buttigieg. And he got over 30% in the 5 wealthiest counties, much higher than he got statewide. That's in the first ballot before people rearranged. After they rearranged, it went even more towards him. So again, Buttigieg is a guy who, and a lot of the people who voted for him were people who were very optimistic about the future. So he's winning the elite vote. The Iowans who most think the American dream is alive, even if they hate the president, they're picking a guy like Buttigieg. Bloomberg coming in, I think he's going to pick up a lot of those, so it's going to get messy. But Bernie Sanders is a candidate of 2 types of people. Sort of ideological young people on the left, but also to some extent the alienated. He's winning in a lot of the places or in Iowa, he won in a lot of the places where Trump did exceptionally well by saying, you know what, this system is broken. So this is interesting, right? Trump said, I alone can fix it. You need a strong man to come in and fix things. And he's wrong because what's going to fix things is your community getting stronger. Sanders is coming in and saying, you need socialism to fix it.
Right.
He's wrong, in my opinion, but both of these people are tapping into the perception that the American dream is dead and succeeding by getting their votes.
You know, it's interesting. I moderated a conversation in Santa Monica about foreign policy a couple weeks ago, and Andy Card, George W. Bush's former chief of staff, was one of the speakers and lives in New Hampshire. And he told the story that back in 2016, he had a neighbor that had a Bernie Sanders sign up, and after Sanders didn't win the nomination, that sign went down and the Trump sign went up.
Yep.
And the polling back in 16, which showed kind of the either the second choice being the other, is and now looking at it through this lens, it's pretty interesting how one kind of took a personal "I'll fix this" in Trump, and the other is saying "I'll fix this" through a system.
But both of them were offering really big solutions to a really big problem. And again, I think the solution, especially from Sanders, is wrong. But Hillary responded by saying, the American dream's not dead. It's alive and well across this country. You're just upset because you're a white male Christian who lost your privilege.
Yeah.
And that was a totally false story.
Yeah. So thoughts now that we're into 2020, have you had any engagement with the alienated communities, if you will, about how they view Trump? I mean, if this became, which it obviously will be on the right, it'll be Trump, the Republican candidate, but if it was a Trump versus a Buttigieg or somebody that was more kind of on the elite side, do you have a sense of how they view Trump
yes,
today?
so one interesting media phenomenon is the New York Times desperately trying to find Trump supporters in the working class who are going to come and say, oh, I hate that guy. He hasn't delivered. I'm going to go with a Democrat. There are some farmers who don't like what the trade war has done, but for the most part, people who voted for Trump and who agree that the American dream is dead, I think almost without exception, they're all going to support Trump again. Because they weren't looking for him. I was saying they kind of were looking for a strong man to fix a problem, but not so much to fix a problem, but somebody to say, all this stuff is broken, and to have a scapegoat, to blame Washington, to blame the elites, to kind of proverbially punch the media in the face. He even put out a video where he's punching CNN in the face. And so sort of fighting the bad guys and venting the frustration. I've been married, yesterday was my anniversary. We've been married 14 years. One of the things you slowly learn as a husband is your wife doesn't necessarily need you to solve the problem she's telling you. She needs you to acknowledge that it's a problem and sympathize with her. Well, Donald Trump, you might not think he's the best husband in the world. On the other hand, he's been a husband 3 times, so he has a lot of practice. But that's what he is to the voters. He says, yes, the game is rigged against you. And he won't say, I feel your pain, as Bill Clinton did, but that's a huge part of what they're looking for. So the question is going to be, if somebody like Bloomberg or Buttigieg is nominated, somebody who's not Sanders, will Trump reach even further into the white working class? He did exceptionally well among them, but still he got about 50% of it. There were a lot of Democrats who stayed home or who held their nose and voted for Hillary. And I think Trump could expand on how on the white working class vote if he's running against a Bloomberg or a Buttigieg.
So we're going to go to your questions here in a minute. So if you have some questions, please write them down and get them over to Melissa. So the hardest thing about reading Bowling Alone and Coming Apart and Our Kids is that when they get to the part where they're trying to offer some prescription, both Putnam and Murray acknowledge those are the weakest chapters of their books. And at one part, I remember in Coming Apart, towards the end, Murray essentially says, well, the elites that are living these socially conservative lifestyles need to be more forthright about the advantage that they're experiencing from them. And then called for some sort of civic great awakening that might arise out of that. These are such deep cultural issues that I wonder, either have you seen, or is there a model that can be replicated to say that if we want to create these communities where we don't see these levels of alienation, that these are the things that we need to do?
So it's the most interesting thing about the book is a year old. The paperback out there, you guys are going to be the first people actually able to buy the paperback, so that's very exciting. It's a first edition paperback. But the book tour, I've run into all these groups and these individuals who spend their life working with the addicts, with the single moms, with the orphans. And I've found so many of them have come around through their experience to a similar idea. And one woman said, I work with addicts and children of addicts, and I realized no program ever helped any one of these people. Relationships help these people. So what these nonprofits are doing is they're going into communities, and it's case by case. You can't have some national program doing this. There's no national federal Department of Community Cohesion. That would be counterproductive. But in community by community level, these people are saying, what I'm doing is I'm trying to find for this mother people who are nearby, who can babysit, who are also mothers, who can help give her a ride. All these things that, again, if you belong to a tight-knit community, you have and you maybe take for granted, and that, or if you were like a solitary millionaire, you would spend all your money to have what we all get through these strong communities, saying we're going to try to build around these people we're working with such a community. And another one having to do with marriage, it's called Communio. Have you followed this?
Yes.
And so you might explain it better than I can, but the idea was they said people who are going to get married, not get divorced, reduce domestic violence, we're going to immerse couples into communities. And the way they're reporting their numbers, it looks like it's working really well. And again, they're doing it like a pilot program here, and then in one community, and then in another community. And so that's the thing that I've come across a ton of people who are saying, we are reorienting our sort of social service nonprofit towards plugging people into relationships. However much money we give them, nutrition information, financial information we give them, the homilies don't work. So like when we say, oh, you liberal elites need to preach what you practice, I don't think the preaching works. The systems, the infrastructure, the ecosystem of community is what's going to help people. And that's going to have to be done by, and governments can fund them, but it's going to be done by small groups acting on a very local level.
So we have a couple questions here about the impact of technology. And I think certainly the data is out there when you're looking at Gen Z and millennials that screen time, the impact of technology and how we communicate one with another is creating a greater sense of loneliness. And Sherry Turkle, who's a researcher at MIT, a couple great books on this, wrote a great book called Reclaiming Conversation, in which he looked at declining levels of empathy in younger demographics. What are your thoughts on the impact of technology?
Yeah, and I talk about in the book, not in intense depth, but I do talk about how technology does pull us away from the people around us. It's not only negative, but I'll talk about the positives in a second. But one very interesting phenomenon I've noticed is one New York Times tech writer who's based out in Silicon Valley realized how many of these executives and wealthy programmers don't let their children have smartphones. So again, the elite privilege that they're sort of keeping as a secret. What they're selling to our kids, they're keeping away from, they're keeping away from their own. And 15, 20 years ago, you remember talks about technology was, oh, it's a technology gap. These wealthy people are going to have all these great gadgets, and the working class and the poor aren't. No, now human interaction is the luxury good. To have a teacher sitting and talking to you, to have classmates, have involved parents in your school, that's the luxury good. Everybody can have a cheap tablet, and they do. And so one of the things I talk about at the beginning of the book is men dropping out of the labor force. A lot of what's dragging them out of the labor force is devices, TV, internet, tablets, etc. Because they don't. It has a dulling effect on your life. But I wouldn't have had a 20th high school reunion if it wasn't for Facebook. Social media often serves to help people come together physically, and that's the good side of it.
Right.
And another good side of it is that sort of virtual community is better than no community. I have a lot of friends in Washington, D.C., and frankly, like libertarian nerds in Washington, D.C. is a very big demographic. And the ones my age, when like the internet or pre-internet bulletin board systems, when that came into being in high school, these guys were like, this saved me. I didn't like anybody in my high school. I didn't care about sports. I didn't play an instrument. I cared about the spectacular Spider-Man. And there were, 1,000 other people I found around the country who cared about it too. And, like somebody's dog would die in this spectacular Spider-Man bulletin board system online, and that people would send them condolence notes and that sort of thing. And so that's better than nothing. But if virtual community pulls you away from physically proximate community, meat space as they call it, then it's a net negative. Right now, I think it's a net negative. I think it's possible that in the long run, we'll look at social media and say, well, no, that's actually, it does more harm, it does more good than harm because it brings people together. That's not what it is right now. Right now, I think it's more harm than good.
Another one of Putnam's studies after Bowling Alone that did not get as much coverage, I think in large part because his results and conclusions were fairly controversial, was a report that he did back in 2005, 2006 called E Pluribus Unum, in which he analyzed the civic engagement and civic trust of 40 American cities, and looking at a variety of different questions, from how often you go to community meetings, to do you know who your neighbors are, to do you participate in working in community associations. And what he found in looking across the 40 cities was an inverse relationship between cities that had high levels of ethnic diversity and their levels of what he called civic trust or civic participation. And in fact, the 3 cities that had the highest levels of ethnic diversity and the lowest levels of trust were LA, San Francisco, and Minneapolis. And the 2 places where he found a positive correlation between high levels of ethnic diversity and civic trust were in Protestant megachurches and Catholic churches.
Amen. Yep.
So I wondered if, especially as we are becoming more diverse, and some of these communities, whether it's Chevy Chase or Orange City, are pretty homogenous from an ethnic standpoint, how we think about these issues around alienation in high levels of ethnic diversity.
The first thing I would say is if you think diversity and social trust are good, and you look at that data, you have to say, well, maybe church is good for America.
Yeah.
And that's not something that a lot of people who really value diversity are willing to say. That my parish is incredibly diverse, economically, ethnically, and that sort of thing. Just because of where it happens to be geographically, it ropes together a lot of different types of places. But we're not diverse. Well, and actually in our school, some of the most involved parents are non-Catholics, but they all believe in that Catholic education is good. But diversity along multiple dimensions is really hard to get. I write a little bit about it. I want to read. So the first thing is that, again, taking the early Trump support, one thing, if you adjust for income, Trump did better in places, in the early primaries, in places with more immigration. And in some of these places, in general, it was white working class people in places that experience a lot of recent immigration were more likely, I think, to say the American dream is dead. And so one of the ways I talk about it is this. It's not that immigrants are bad at community. The opposite is probably true. Many immigrant communities tend to be more close-knit than the average Americans. Instead, we can say that new immigrants in a community, especially a smaller community, can make community solidarity and cooperation harder to achieve. Most obviously, there's a Tower of Babel effect. While hearing many languages as you walk down the streets of Geneva or Manhattan can be exhilarating, a common language is a pretty fundamental precondition of community. Literally being able to speak to others, especially in one's first language, is pretty important for forming bonds. Also, people born in different parts of the world will have different customs, traditions, and celebrations. These differences erect challenges to cohesion. For instance, I have a neighbor from India. He and I talk on the sidewalk regularly about India, about American politics, about immigration. He's a Hare Krishna. While most immigrants to the U.S. are Christian, the immigrant population is disproportionately non-Christian. So why does my neighbor's religion matter? After a few months of driveway chats and him occasionally giving me a ride to the metro stop, I invited Mr. Patel for a beer on my back deck. This is the most normal way I, an Irish Catholic, get to know a guy. But Mr. Patel, for religious reasons, doesn't drink alcohol. That creates a barrier to our bonding while being admirable. Coffee? No. Tea? No. Herbal tea? Sorry. So for months, I was frustrated. Finally, I had to approach him with an awkwardly direct question. Mr. Patel, I would like to have you over for a drink, but what liquids do you actually consume? I've got some lime LaCroix here. No dice. He said the waste of putting water into cans and bottles violated his religious obligation to care for creation. Finally, he suggested water with some lemon or lime in it. So I sent my kids off to the grocery store to pick up a lemon and a lime. I filled a couple pitchers with water, and after my kids went to bed, Mr. Patel and I finally got to know each other over many glasses of gently citrified water. This shows it isn't impossible to bridge cultural gaps, but that it takes a lot of effort and has a lot of potential pitfalls. It's reasonable to infer, then, that cultural differences tend to weaken community bonds. In other words, it becomes harder when you have these differences to form cohesion. It takes more work. You guys should all do that work, but if we're thinking about it from a sociological perspective, we have to think, what can help people overcome it? The first obvious thing is going to be faith, but on a community level, that's something community leaders have to think. What common undertaking can we get people involved in to help bridge these gaps?
So you've been involved with an initiative at the policy school called the American Project. And one of the things that the American Project has been exploring is the future of the conservative movement. And one of the places we've kind of landed is that we believe that the future of conservatism is more communitarian than libertarian.
Yep.
And so I wondered if you could speak, you quote Nisbet in here, who's I think in many ways kind of the intellectual godfather of communitarianism, a great Californian, by the way.
Oh, I didn't know it.
I wondered if you could speak to our political rhetoric and communitarianism philosophically and historically also has roots on the left as well. If you could talk a little bit about how you're seeing politics moving forward, maybe post-Trump, and the prospects for a more communitarian understanding of whether it be conservatism or progressivism.
Yeah, certainly on both the left and the right, you see a lot of increase in communitarian talk. And in fact, a big part of what Bernie Sanders really talked about, if you listen closely to him, was you people need to be empowered. And when I talked at the convention where he had already lost to Hillary in the nomination, somebody said, the main reason I'm glad I volunteered on this is I got to know all my neighbors who were also volunteering on this, and we're going to use this power to go do something else. What was the power they had? It was that they were connected to one another, knew each other, and knew that they could ask favors of each other, had their phone numbers, or could text each other. That was the power, and so there's a lot of that. And you go to neighborhoods, I'm sure, I don't know if it's true in LA, but it's true all around New York and DC, where all of a sudden, in DC, the most common tattoo I see on people these days is a Washington, DC flag. When I moved to DC 20 years ago, there was not hometown pride. There was poor people who had grown up there, who saw it as a bad place to grow up, and then there was the constant churn of people from out of town. Now there's a lot of hometown pride. Your neighborhood in Brooklyn is like, oh no, I don't go over to Park Slope. They're all a bunch of yuppies. I'm here in Carroll Gardens. Like hometown local pride, and all that stuff is happening on the left. And you're right that a lot of conservatives are starting to realize, okay, if we're emphasizing just sort of economic success through capitalism, we're not giving people a path to the good life. So Marco Rubio has tried to address this. Josh Hawley has tried to address some of the problems.
Senator from Missouri.
Yeah, with social media. I think so. A lot of the solutions they're proposing, especially on the federal level, I've got real apprehension about. But the fact that they're sort of acknowledging, both on the left, which can tend to think poor people just need a welfare check, or on the right, poor people just need a better economy, that both of them are moving away from the purely materialistic explanation,
Yep.
I think is a positive development.
I was speaking to a group of older adults at a community college event in Santa Monica, which is where I live, and I was asked to talk about this communitarian conservatism, and I talked quite a bit about your book, and I was told before I got up to speak by the person who invited me to speak, he said, Pete, I just want to let you know it's going to be about 120 people, and these are all going to be baby boomer leftists, typical kind of Santa Monicans. And so I'm wondering how I'm going to connect with this audience, and I thought, well, my wife is fourth generation Santa Monican, I'm going to lean on her and her story. And so I talked about the fact that whenever my in-laws who live down in Orange County, whenever they come back up to Santa Monica, they're always talking about how much the city has changed and how it used to be this idyllic beach town in the 40s and 50s and early 60s when they lived here, and how it's just so much busier and takes so much longer to get across town. And I'm looking out at the audience, and I'm starting to see some shoulders come down, and people are starting to nod and look at one another. And then I said, you know, it's almost like they want to make Santa Monica great again. And that acknowledgement that where they lived was something that they loved.
Yeah.
Was something that people were very willing to acknowledge at the local level, but when you were talking about things at a national level, all of a sudden we're wondering about nationalism and are we going too far? But this kind of inherent human need for community.
No, but the counter sort of, the argument I get sort of mostly against this book is we can't all just retreat into little enclaves, and local control in the past was a code word for redlining, and state control was an excuse for Jim Crow and that sort of stuff. And so there really is still a resistance to localism on the left, and on the right I find it too in a particular brand of nationalism, where there was a guy on Fox News who said, it's such a shame that people still even consider themselves Irish Americans or Dutch Americans or hyphenated Americans at all. He said, my grandfather was from Norway. I don't speak any Norwegian, and I think that's what all of America should be. So that's sort of the melting pot image, right? And there's a real sort of niceness to that story, but on the other hand, the places where I find it strongest, nobody's just sort of like blank American. They have pride either in their ethnicity and their religion, like in Oostburg, or just in their neighborhood, or maybe what college they went to. Like, you have to have the American dream that Tocqueville describes. You have to have a multifaceted identity. You have to belong to lots of things.
And the inverse is true, though, where people just saw themselves as American, and you talked about this in the book. That's where you saw the highest levels of alienation. Yeah,
so the Census Bureau asks people, what is your ancestry? And they usually say, for example, German, African American, etc. About 10% of the country just says American, not Native American, just says American. So again, I would say Irish, Holly Vander something would say Dutch. The biggest chunks is German. 10% say just American. And if you look at the counties with the highest concentration of just American, it's where you find the highest concentration of men who've dropped out of the labor force. It's where you find the ground zero of the opioid epidemic. So my argument, what I suggest and it was a big predictor of the Trump vote early on. My argument is that people who don't sort of inherit traditions and who don't belong to as many things are more likely to feel this sense of alienation and a sense of purposelessness.
So let's conclude where, obviously, we're 8, 9, 10 months away from what is going to be the next historic presidential election here. Is there anything that you're seeing as far as indicators that you think that we as engaged people politically should be looking at? We pretty much know who the Republican nominee is going to be, but what do you think might be some indicators, especially in these next few weeks as we head into Super Tuesday and beyond, that might portend where the Democratic nominee may be coming from?
So the incumbent always has an advantage of kind of having a coalition that's there. The challenger is always trying to, you got to win the primary, you got to grab some from there, and kind of bring everybody together. And if you don't successfully bring everybody together, you can't win. So you've got some Democrats, and particularly ones who dropped out, were kind of running against the religious right. Like, when I get there, I'm going to punish the bad guys. And the fact is that can alienate some of the religious left, including the African American vote, which is very church attending and all of that. You've got some who are running against the white working class, the deplorables, and that's not going to be successful. So the question is going to, and then you've got a lot who are reaching out for the Santa Monica vote. Well, not the Santa Monica vote because they already have that, but the reaching out for the upper middle class, suburban white voter who voted for Mitt Romney, who didn't really have that much of a problem with Obama, and who definitely did not vote for Donald Trump, and then probably voted for Democrat in Congress. So they're trying to get the connected class vote. They're trying to get, they want to get the socialist, young leftist vote. But can they also get the alienated working class vote? Can they rope those things in? That's what I'm looking for. Bloomberg just jumped on the scene. I don't know what he's going to do that. Buttigieg has tried. At times, he's pushed away the religious voters with the way he talks. And Kamala was the one who was most sort of running against the bad guys.
Right.
So I was happy that, and the bad guys being me, I was happy that she failed. So that's the main thing I'm looking for. As a couple of front runners emerge, are they going to reach out to the white working class, the African American religious communities, while also reaching out to the connected class, and can they somehow rope them all together? That is not easy. I don't envy anybody trying to do that.
Yeah, and I think that the battle for the ethnic minority but religiously faithful voter is going to be a pivotal group. Please join me in thanking Tim Carney. So this wraps up tonight's event. Thanks so much for joining us. If you'd like to be on our mailing list, we have a few more political type events coming up here this spring semester. If you'd like to be on our mailing list, just please let Melissa know. Obviously, we have some flyers there at the tables if you want to know more about the School of Public Policy. But thanks so much for joining us tonight. God bless and good night.